Hello everyone, Inquisitor Vaughn here, and in today's video I want to continue with our Primarch Project deep dives by going into the 18th Primarch Project, who would be designated Vulkan. For the list of correspondences for this Primarch Project number 18's designated name would be Vulkan. The specialization of war of his legion would be mechanical engineering. The aspect of humanity that I assign to this Primarch Project is Heroism, and the Geneseed organ that I most associate with the Primarch and his legion is the Melanochrome. Primarch Project number 18's gestation pod would land on the world of Nocturne. Nocturne is classified in Imperial records as both a death world and a feudal world. Located in the Segmentum Ultima, Nocturne is an extremely active volcanic environment influenced by the gravitational pull of Prometheus, Nocturne's giant moon. The moon itself is so large that it pulls the tectonic plates on Nocturne, encouraging the formation of immense volcanoes, most of which are nearly always active. Due to the constant movement of the surface of Nocturne, the humans who settled on the world during humanity's expansion into the stars during the Dark Age of technology learned quickly that it was best to live underground in vast subterranean holes. The conditions of the planet shaped both the Nocturnians and the civilization on Nocturne in unique ways. Nocturne's star beams the planet with harsh rays of radiation, which are in turn absorbed into the planet's surface, warming its already hot environment and increasing the amount of infrared radiation that is emitted from the planet itself. The solar radiation that would normally be reflected back into the atmosphere is trapped by the ash clouds that form from the volcanic eruptions on the planet, further heating the planet. As a result, Nocturne is extremely hot, and by that condition alone, it would fit the qualifications to be considered a death world, because no normal human being could survive on it for long. The Nocturnians were once standard human beings, but that would change. Over the span of many generations, the settlers of Nocturne would genetically mutate, developing a pitch black skin complexion that matched most of the natural life on fauna in order to withstand the heat and the harsh rays of radiation. Not only this, but their eyes are a deep red color that reflects light and appears to glow. Their eyes have the ability to see on the infrared levels of the electromagnetic spectrum due to the large amount of heat and infrared beams that interact with their environment. Nocturne is normally a hostile world of constant shifting, which prevented advanced civilization from being established on its surface. Instead, a feudal-style society existed within its settlement cities. The settlement cities were basically epicenters of humanity on the world. These cities are located at the most seismically stable areas on Nocturne that were discovered by the shamans or latent psychers of the settler population. Here, metalwork and craftsmanship were valuable trades that were supported harshly by the planet's temperament. Native life did thrive in Nocturne's biosphere, in its deserts, mountains, and oceans, but in unique ways. Most of the life forms on Nocturne were saurian, or lizard-like by design, and reminiscent of the dinosaurs of ancient Terra. For example, the dactylid and their larger genus, the dactylon, were basically Nocturne's version of pterodactyls. The gorlodons of Nocturne were basically triceratops, described as draconian creatures with a three-horned, bone-plated skull. The sark, which were saurian pack hunters that hunted in the desert, were basically raptors. Even saurochs, which were described as part bovine, part saurus herd animals, were basically iguanodons. Most of the life forms on Nocturne were either saurian or reptilian and strangely adapted to the world, like the Norlhorn, which was an oceanic beast that had volcanic rock as skin. Most of these life forms were hunted by the Nocturnian tribesmen for food or as a rite of passage. One of the most interesting of these life forms was the salamander, which were large lizards on the planet that frequent a specific, particularly volcanic area of Nocturne called Mount Deathfire. A specific genus of the salamander grows to be a large size and develops the ability to breathe fire as a defense mechanism, the only creature on the world said to have this ability. These mighty beasts were regarded with an almost sacred reverence by the Nocturnians, and they were called fire drakes. Nocturne had its own winter. One Nocturnian year was 15 Terran years, and every Nocturnian year was an event called the Time of Trial. During this time, Prometheus traveled so close to Nocturne that it nearly tore the planet apart, the gravitational pull causing tsunamis to crash into the land, earthquakes shook the planet itself, thousands of volcanoes exploded. Due to the eruptions, the atmosphere became thick with smoke, blocking out the sun and decreasing the temperature on the world significantly, causing an ash winter. Towns would collapse, the young would freeze, livestock would die, unable to take the cold as they did the heat. This lasts for 3.5 years and is a time of survival for all Nocturnians. It is a harsh period on the world, and through generations experiencing and enduring this, the Nocturnian people developed into temperamentally strong, resilient, and stoic people. If they survived this time of trials, the world would go back to how it was previously, and due to the increased tectonic movement, the riches of the earth were revealed to them in the form of gems, metals, and precious stones, which were used as a form of economy. It would be on this world that the 18th Primarch Project's station pod would land during the time of trial. According to the stories of the Nocturnians, his pod would crash into the abode of the blacksmith called Nibel. Nibel had been located in the city settlements of Hesiod, known as the seat of the tribal kings, a royal city on Nocturne. Seeing the child within as a fulfillment of Nocturnian mythology, Nibel would name the child Vulkan and adopt him as his own. Like all Primarchs who landed in extreme environments, the 18th Primarch Project's body immediately adapted to the environment of Nocturne, developing a pitch black complexion and red eyes that could see on the infrared spectrum. Like all Primarchs, Vulkan grew fast and larger than anyone around him, larger than many other Primarchs in fact, and grew into full adulthood in only 3 Terran years. He adopted the culture of the Nocturnians and also became an extremely talented blacksmith whose reputation circulated the different settlements. In Vulkan's 4th year, Nocturne fell under the attack of Xenos that were known as Dusk Wraiths, but who were in reality the Drukhari that were there to gather slaves. This happened before Vulkan ever arrived on the world, but this was his first encounter with the Xenos. While those in Hesiod ran and hid away from the Xenos, Vulkan stood refusing to hide, armed with 2 hammers. Rousing his people to fight, the Nocturnians stood at his side and fought against the Xenos, driving them back from their raid and achieving victory. After this, the leaders of the settlement cities would travel to Hesiod to pay their respects to Vulkan, vowing before him that they would do as he had done, fighting against the enemy rather than hiding from them. It was after his victory against the Dark Eldar that Vulkan became known as the Fireborn, and celebrations would be held over his victory. These celebrations included demonstrations of strength and skill at blacksmithing, as was tradition amongst the settlements of the world. From amongst the contestants was a stranger. This stranger was the emperor of mankind, but not knowing who he was, the peoples considered him an outsider who was clearly different from them. The stranger stood out from amongst the Nocturnians as his skin was not as dark of a complexion as the world bestowed upon its natural inhabitants, and neither were his eyes red. He openly challenged Vulkan to a contest, and while the other Nocturnians laughed, Vulkan was curious. The Outlander would include one condition, that whoever won the contest would have the loyalty and obedience of the loser. Vulkan the Fireborn agreed to the challenge. The contest between the Emperor and the 18th Primarch Project would last for 8 local Nocturnian days, which, considering the difference in time between Nocturne and Terra, meant that it lasted for weeks. The Outlander proved himself just to be as godlike as Vulkan himself, and in each competition the results were a draw between the two. In the Anvil Lift, which is where the contestants were to hold an anvil over their heads for the longest period of time, the Emperor and Vulkan tied, holding their anvils over their head for almost an entire day without signs of tiredness. The rest of the competitions were of an unknown nature, but finally the elders of the Nocturnian settlements determined that a fitting test for the two godlike beings would be to journey to Mount Deathfire, abode of the fire-breathing salamanders, and return with the carcass of the largest fire drake that they could find. The person with the largest fire drake would win the competition. Both contestants were given a day to craft a weapon with which they would slay their prey. Both worked tirelessly at the forges, and in the end, Vulkan created an immense warhammer and the Emperor created a sword. With their weapons created, both contestants made their way to Mount Deathfire. It said in the stories that Vulkan found an immense fire drake and knocked its head off with his warhammer before carrying the carcass back down the volcano. As he was descending, the volcano erupted and Vulkan was nearly killed, falling before grabbing onto the edge of a cliff with one hand and holding the tail end of the fire drake with his other hand. He held on for hours, hanging off this cliff until his grip began to loosen. At this moment, the Emperor emerged carrying an even larger fire drake than Vulkan's. To the Primarch's surprise, the Emperor would throw his fire drake into the lava below, using its fire-resistant hide as a bridge over which both Vulkan and the Emperor would cross. Vulkan would still stubbornly hold on to his kill when the two made it back to the spectators. Vulkan was declared the winner of the contest simply because he had a fire drake where the Emperor did not, but Vulkan would silence the crowd and instead kneel before the Emperor. Vulkan would let it be known that the Outlander had saved him from death and was worthy of his loyalty. At this moment, the Emperor would reveal his true identity as the Emperor of Mankind. Vulkan would be made the ruler of Nocturne by his mandate and was revealed to be one of the Emperor's Primarch projects. He would require Vulkan to leave Nocturne to learn of his position within the greater scheme of things, and Vulkan would agree, but he had reservations about leaving his world and his people undefended. The Emperor would inform Vulkan that his role was not simply to defend his world, but thousands of worlds across the galaxy who suffered from the predation of darkness and Xenos, just as the Nocturnians had. The Emperor would tell Vulkan that his world would be protected by his sons, the 18th Legion, who were made from him. For a time, Vulkan would learn of the Great Crusade from the Emperor directly. Vulkan, who was already a talented weaponsmith, would learn even more from his brother Primarch Pharasmanis and from the Mechanicus of Mars. Vulkan's identity was unknown to the growing Imperium, but he was seen, a giant warrior in emerald green armor scaled like the dragons of legend, fighting beside the Emperor in early campaigns. It was during this time that Vulkan proved himself to be a ferocious warrior, possessed of a fury that was similar to that of Leman Russ, impressing even Pharasmanis of Medusa, but at the same time, Vulkan was odd in how much importance he put on the value of human life. To humanity, he was far more compassionate than any other of the Primarchs. Vulkan was a Primarch of duality, of terrifying visage, with his pitch-black skin and burning red eyes, with his beast-like fury, but also his concern and compassion for humanity, and skill in the arts of blacksmithing and weapons crafting. Vulkan would fight beside the Emperor and his Primarch brothers for some time before being reunited with his own legion. Before we move forward with the video, let's circle back and go over some of the details of the Primarch's story. The world that the Primarch Project would land on would be called Nocturne, which means night in High Gothic, but which was French for of the night in real world, and referred to art pieces centered on the night. The settlement cities in which the peoples of the world gathered were named Hesiod, Themis, Epimethus, Heliosa, Athenion, Clymene, and Scarrock. With the exception of one, Skarok, the other settlement names are all Greek in origin. Hesiod was the name of a Greek poet. Themis is the name of a Greek titan and goddess of justice. Epimetheus is a version of Epimetheus, who was the Greek titan of afterthought. Heliosa is a version of Helios, which was a Greek god of the sun. Athenion is a changing of Athenion, which was a Greek name. Clymene was one of the children of the titan Oceanus. Even Nocturne's moon, Prometheus, is named after the Greek titan who stole fire from the gods and gave it to humanity. So already, the world has a lot of Greek themes attached to it. Despite this, when Nibel named the Primarch Project, he named him Vulkan, which is a respelling of Vulcan. Vulcan was the Roman god of fire who was connected to volcanoes, deserts, the fire of the forge, and metalworking. His Greek counterpart was Hephaestus. I find it interesting that he wasn't named that, all things being considered. The 18th Legion of the Astartes had mysterious beginnings. What is known is that the 18th Legion was part of the Trefoil Legions, 3 legions whose foundings were veiled and somewhat isolated from the others. The other 2 legions that were part of this trinity would eventually become the Space Wolves and the Alpha Legion. Unlike the other legions, information on the initial recruits and where they were taken from on Terra are also unknown for the 18th Legion. There was so much secrecy around the creation of the 18th Legion that it was said that only the Emperor and a few of the geneticists involved in their creation knew any details about the Legion. Vulkan himself was a unique Primarch project because he was a perpetual. A perpetual is an individual who either developed the genetic mutation or was imbued with the mutation of physical immortality. Perpetuals are virtually invulnerable to destruction and can regenerate from even the most grievous and fatal of wounds. The Emperor is a perpetual, and so is Malcador the Sigillite. Technically, by adding his own genetic information to the Custodes and to the Primarchs, the Emperor would make them all artificial perpetuals. While it wouldn't give them the ability to regenerate from grievous wounds, it would give them an extended lifespan far over the normal lifespan of normal human beings. Vulkan was an actual perpetual. He wouldn't know this until much later in his life, but Vulkan could not truly die and would regenerate from wounds that would kill the Emperor's other creations. This is what made Vulkan unique from the other Primarch projects. He was more of a perpetual than his brothers. While I haven't yet went over the Alpha Legion, what is known about the creation of the Primarch Leman Russ was that foreign genetic information was incorporated into his Primarch template, the Canis Helix. This would result in his legion, the Space Wolves, having lupine or wolf-like physical features, animalistic natures, and bestial senses. The Space Wolves were one of the Trefoil Legions whose purpose was separate from the other legions. In my Primarch video for Leman Russ, I determined that both Leman Russ and his legion were created to police humanity and bring them back into compliance when they strayed. Similar to the Night Lords, they were meant to terrify humanity, with the Space Wolves being naturally predatory Astartes that were efficient hunter-killers that could track down their prey through scent alone. Despite their bestial natures, they were amongst the most loyal and trusted of the legions. I theorize that whatever the purpose of the remaining 2 legions of the Trefoil, both would be modified with extra genetic information added to their Primarch's templates, and they would be defined by their direct relation to humanity. Taking this theory and applying it to the 18th Primarch Project and his legion, I theorize that Vulkan was intentionally made a perpetual by the Emperor, who likely added the genetic mutation into Vulkan's Primarch template. Even Vulkan's nature might have been influenced by this extra genetic information because, according to available information, most perpetuals would eventually become kings and rulers due to their nearly inherent belief that they were meant to guide humanity, which would itself explain the source of Vulkan's compassion and care toward humanity, as well as his passionate defense of it. The creation of the Primarch Vulkan might have also been the reason why the 18th Legion was initially separated from the other legions. Though the 18th Legion did engage in wars during the Unification Wars, records of these situations were scarce or hidden. The first engagement they fought in that was known across the Emperor's fighting forces at the time was the assault of the Tempest Galleries against the Ethnarch of the Caucasus Wastes. One of the most powerful enemies that the Emperor had during the Unification Wars was a figure known as the Ethnarch, who ruled over a region in the Caucasus Peninsula of Europe, or what would be called Europa in the 40k setting. This techno-barbarian stronghold was called the Caucasus Wastes. The figure known as the Ethnarch was in many ways similar to the Emperor and was largely influential, but he maintained a small empire protected by formidable powered field generators and defended from attack by genetically modified warriors called Urcasis, which were the Ethnarch's version of Thunder Warriors. He also enslaved psychers and used horrible weapons made from the Dark Age of technology. When the Emperor first attempted to eliminate the Caucasus Wastes, it cost him tens of thousands of Thunder Warriors and millions of casualties from amongst the Imperial army. Learning from this mistake, the Emperor would gather his forces once more, but this time he would implement the 18th Legion. Seeing that the source of the Ethnarch's protection was its shield generators rooted deep into the earth, the Emperor would target an attempt to dismantle them. For this task, he would assign the 18th Legion, who would descend underground through the use of termite burrowers retrofitted with technology acquired from Mars, and destroying the shield generators at their very foundations. During this engagement, and likely previous to it, the 18th Legion's color scheme was a yellow mottled with black in a camouflage-like pattern, and their heraldry was a skull with red burning eyes. At the beginning of the assault, 20,000 legionnaires of the 18th Legion would salute the Emperor before entering their termite drills and descending deep into the earth. The Imperial forces on the surface would quickly lose contact with the Legion, and not even the psychers amongst the Emperor's forces could even reach them. Days became weeks and weeks became months with no communication from the 18th Legion. The leaders of the Imperial forces would begin to question if the force ever made it to their objective, but the Emperor would silence them, stating, "They will not fail me, they will return from the fire, thus it shall ever be." Soon after saying that, there was widespread earthquakes and the shield generators that were protecting the Caucasus Wastes powered off, allowing the Emperor's forces to descend upon the enemies and defeat them. After the victory, those legionnaires who had survived the underground battle rode their termite drills back to the surface. Only around 1,000 of the 20,000 legionnaires that initially descended had survived the conflict. Their reports at what had happened revealed that the Legion had went through the fires of hell in order to achieve their assigned objective. Not really knowing what they would find, but trusting in their own skill as well as the Emperor's judgment, the 18th Legion tunneled into a subterranean realm that was like its own world under the surface of the earth. Vast machines turned over what could be described as caged seas of molten metal taken from the planet's core. These machines were suspended on webs of silicate rock and generated blinding arcs of lightning between each other. The environment was inhospitable to anything living. It was an airless furnace, and because of this, the 18th Legion didn't face anything living. Instead, they faced cybernetic horrors from before the Age of Strife, sleepless relics of the Dark Age of technology that took the form of mechanical spiders and blackened service automata that reacted to the presence of the Legion with hostility, attacking them. These machines were like nothing that had ever been experienced before. Built to withstand the super hot environments, meltaguns and plasma gunfire had little effect on them. Bolt rounds bounced off their carapace. The only vulnerability the machines had were in their joints, and the only way to damage them was through blunt force, which required close combat with these towering automata. By the time the 18th Legion understood this, hundreds had already died and many more were being killed inside their termite drills by the machine environment's self-awareness of its own attack. The 18th Legion had reached what would later be referred to as the Tempest Galleries. As they fought through the endless tunnels, caverns, and underground theaters, the machines confronted them in a never-ending tide, and it would later be discovered that the machines were being produced by the machine spirit of the gallery in order to defend itself. Machine spirit is what the Imperium would later call the consciousness of the machine. In reality, it was artificial intelligence controlling an STC generator which produced the machines that the Legion faced. Thousands of legionnaires died with every step through the galleries. Still, they would fight on with a mix of discipline and suicidal determination. The 18th Legion did not fight with a sense of self-preservation, only with motivation to see their task complete, and legionnaires would willingly throw themselves to their death so that their battle brothers could push only steps forward through the galleries. The Legion also showed an impressive skill in the manipulation of technology and crafting of weapons. They would use panels of the destroyed machines to add extra protection to their own armor, create improvised close combat weapons, and they would even manipulate the machine constructs inner working and use them to fight against other machines. Death came in dozens of ways to the 18th Legion, being crushed by the movement of tectonic plates, falling into oceans of lava, being destroyed by machines. Still, they fought on, eventually finding the generator of the machines and using a two-pronged attack to confuse its systems and attack it directly, while also targeting the base of one of the shield generators. The attack was successful and both the generator and the shields were destroyed, though at a savage cost to the Legion, where 20,000 warriors descended into the Tempest galleries, only 1,000 would emerge to the surface. The Emperor himself would meet with the survivors and bestow upon them the laurel of victory, their first battle honor, inscribed with the words, "In fire and darkness tested." The Legion would also bring machine craft from the galleries back to the surface. Along with submitting some of it to the Imperial authorities, the Legion would also be allowed to keep some of what they recovered. The nature of the 18th Legion was revealed in their assault of the Tempest galleries. Their overwhelming commitment to sacrifice and victory, no matter the cost, became what the Legion would be known for during the Great Crusade. It would also seem that the Legion had always had some sort of technological mastery, even before having met with their Primarch or even before the integration of Astartes from Nocturne, on which weapons crafting was a tradition. Keen listeners of the channel and people who have followed the Primarch series might feel like they've heard this story of subterranean battles against machines elsewhere, and this is because it's very similar to the story of Ferrus Manus leading the tribes of Medusa under the black ice of his world, encountering cybernetic machines and an STC generator as well. Unlike Leman Russ in his Canis Helix, Vulkan's own perpetual nature was not made into an aspect of the Legion's Geneseed. His sons were not immortal, not perpetual. They did not regenerate. They could and did die. However, the 18th Legion fought with a sense of expendability rather than self-importance. The legionnaires of the 18th Legion sacrificed themselves without reservation to assure victory. It would seem that while the gift of the Perpetual did not pass on to Vulkan's sons, the nature of the Perpetual did. The legionnaires of the 18th Legion shouldered the safekeeping of humanity, and there was no amount of blood that they wouldn't spill in order to do so. Okay, so in regards to where the initial recruits for the Legion were taken from, there is no specific information. I have three theories. The first is that the initial recruits were taken from across Terra, recruited from normal, stable humans sourced from a variety of cultures. Because we have no information on where the initial recruits were taken from, it's a safe bet to assume that they were recruited from everywhere on Terra. I have a second theory, and it is that the initial recruits of the 18th Legion came from the Terrawat clan. The Terrawat clan was a clan that ruled the Ural Mountains. They were of the same ideology as the one that would form the Martian Mechanicus, and were masters of the machine on Terra called Technotheologists. The Terawatt clan had isolated themselves during the Age of Strife, and in this way they survived the wars that happened during it. When they emerged, they did so to observe a ravaged world destroyed by conflict. In their lore, it specifically says that they arose to find ethnarchs and tyrants, which by itself suggests that they were near the Caucasus Wastes, but also the Ural Mountains and the Caucasus Mountains were close to each other geographically. When the Emperor discovered the Terawatt clan is unknown, but of all the warlords that would petition the aid of the clan, the Emperor would be the only one who gave them more than he asked from them. It is commonly theorized by Warhammer 40k lore enthusiasts that the Terawatt clan were responsible for the high quality of armor used by the Custodes. This would actually make sense, as even in real-world history, the Ural Mountains were known for their vast material wealth in the forms of iron, copper, gold, coal, oil, mica, and gemstones since the 17th century. A piece of information that is really interesting about the lore for the Tempest Galleries is that at the beginning of the assault, the 18th Legion used termite drills to descend into the depths of the earth. It says that the drills were retrofitted with new technology acquired from Mars. However, the drills themselves had been created on Terra, though it doesn't say by who. Also, it's interesting that the new technology was said to be from Mars, but at the time of the war against the Ethnarchs, the Emperor had yet to leave Terra and ally with Mars. This is perhaps a discrepancy in the lore, but I offer a solution that the drills and technology were from the Terawatt clan, who were basically the machine cult on Terra. Underground in the Tempest Galleries, the 18th Legion showed a degree of technological mastery, not only by modifying their own armor using the metal plating off of the enemy, but they were also rewired some of the automatons to fight for them against the enemy and creating new weapons to help them in their fight. Interestingly enough, at the end of the assault of the Tempest Galleries, the 18th Legion was allowed to keep some of the technology they had found in the underground arena of combat. Even if the initial recruits were not from the Terawatt clan, wherever the initial recruits came from, they had specific training and knowledge in the working of machines. The 18th Legion's victory in the Tempest Galleries won them a fresh new wave of recruits and even gave them access to the newest war gear. But while the Legion was replacing its numbers and resources, the Great Crusade had begun. This made it so that the Legion didn't deploy as a singular force, but similar to the early 5th Legion, was spread out across many expeditionary fleets in small groups or even as individual Astartes amongst the otherwise mortal forces. As part of these detachments, the warriors of the 18th Legion were often fill in a leadership role or a direct fighting role. Because they were Astartes built to take and withstand much damage, the warriors of the 18th Legion were often utilized to engage in the most violent situations or deployed in the location of the greatest threat and heaviest fighting. Their reputation became dual. At times, they were looked at as saviors to the mortal forces around them, but their presence also meant that the mortal forces around them were in the thickest of the fighting. This became something of a foreboding. Imperial army detachments deployed besides groups of the 18th Legion already knew whatever conflict they were entering was going to be the worst situation possible. To the 18th Legion, real victory was emerging triumphant after beating the odds, and this is why retreat wasn't really part of their battle plans. Instead, they would just move forward into the fires of battle to emerge tested and victorious or consumed. During the early Great Crusade, but after the Unification Wars, the color scheme of the 18th Legion was changed to primarily dark green. One shoulder pad was yellow, and the Legion heraldry was a symbol called the Saturnine Ram. This symbol was also used by the first 10 regiments of the Solar Auxilia, who were also called the Saturnine Rams. Now, the meaning of the Saturnine Ram is a symbol is unknown. The name would hint at the Saturnine Ordo, the human polity that lived on and around Saturn in the solar system, but the symbol predated the Emperor making it to Saturn. Generally, the ram is seen as a symbol of determination, power, and leadership, and so maybe it represented that. Circling back before we move forward, the color scheme used by the Legion during the assault on the Tempest Galleries was a tribute to the Rogue Trader color scheme of the Salamanders, which was of the same scheme. The pattern is designed after the animal called the Fire Salamander, which was known to crawl out of fire, having found a home in the logs that were commonly used for bonfires. The symbology of the salamander in the occult is of importance here as well. It represents sulfur and salt, and the quest for the Philosopher's Stone and immortal life, which relate loosely to the perpetual nature of Vulkan. The quote that I put at the beginning of the video concerning the nature of the salamander is from an alchemical book of the salamander as a symbol used in the occult. Okay, so in the videos for this Primarch Project series, I suggest that some of the battles that happened during the Unification Wars were references to real-world historical battles, or that certain legions have the theme of generalized time periods in history. For example, in my Legio Custodes video, I go over correspondences between the Imperial Army and the French Army, as well as the Emperor and Napoleon. In my video on the Iron Hands, I go over how the Terran Legion's origins corresponded with the Industrial Revolution. I have a theory, a very loose theory, that the Unification era 18th Legion and the assault of the Tempest Galleries was at least partially inspired by the Royal Engineers of the British Army during World War I, and I know that sounds like it's coming from left field, but hear me out. The kind of subterranean warfare that the 18th Legion embarked on in order to achieve their objective kind of reminds me of the tunnel-based warfare that was introduced to combat during World War I, when the allied force of British, French, Australian, and New Zealand forces faced off against the German forces. World War I introduced a host of new technology and weapons to the arena of combat, and this is why the casualties during this battle were so horrendous. A technique that was initially used by the Germans, but which led to the creation of a whole new branch of the British military, was the digging of tunnels underneath no man's land to gain access to the enemy's trenches. The ends of these tunnels were packed with explosives, and once detonated, it led to massive casualties towards the enemy. The Royal Engineers of the British Army formed the Tunneler Companies in response. The Tunnelers were composed of around 25,000 volunteers that were mostly recruited from the coal miner communities who were used to subterranean environments. What I'm not saying is that this is a direct correspondence. I didn't create the Legion or write their lore, so I have no idea what was in the creator's mind of this lore when they wrote it. But I'm saying that there is a correspondence of themes. The Emperor sending 20,000 Astartes of the 18th Legion underground to destroy the enemy's shield generators with explosives, and the British Army employing 25,000 volunteers to dig tunnels underneath no man's land to utilize explosives against the enemy. The 18th Legion volunteering during a particularly dangerous part of their mission, and the Royal Tunnelers also being composed of volunteers. The 18th Legion being given the laurel of victory, and the Tunnelers' crests also earning the laurel of the Royal Engineers. The coal miner origin of the Tunnelers might have been an inspiration for the complexion of the Salamanders, as coal miners were known for being covered in black suits. The use of flamers on both sides of the conflict led to huge flamers that were used by the British forces during World War I. They were called Livens large gallery flame projectors, which were horrible flamers put into tunnels during the conflict, which were created by the Royal Engineers. There's quite a few correspondences to be made, and like I said, I don't know what the intentions of the creator of the lore was thinking. I don't know if this is factual. I can't say that it's factual. I'm only saying that because there's a correspondence between historical events and some Warhammer battles, this might have been a reference to it, which specifically was the Battle of the Somme. Earlier I said I had 3 theories as to where the initial recruits for the 18th Legion came from, but I only mentioned 2. The third theory is that the initial recruits of the 18th Legion were all volunteers. This is both due to the correspondence to the tunnelers, but also to the fact that the 18th Legion volunteered to commit to fatal tasks in the Tempest Galleries as a collective and did so enthusiastically. Also, the aftermath of the Tempest Galleries, the wording, it's strange. It says that the Legion won a new wave of recruits. And, usually I wouldn't think anything of this, but winning a new wave of recruits that were inspired by the victory of the Tempest Galleries sounds like people could have just volunteered to join the Legion. And this would be in contrast to being forced to join the Legion or recruited to join the Legion and not having a choice in the matter. I don't know, just a theory. As I said earlier, the Legion didn't fight as a singular force for most of the Great Crusade. However, a large force of around 19,000 legionnaires of the 18th Legion were fighting against millions of orcs alongside the human colony forces of the Terrace system. Because the other legions had been deployed elsewhere, the 18th Legion was forced to deal with the situation on their own. True to their nature, they assisted with the evacuation of at least 3 worlds in the Terra system, but the majority of the Legion was attacked and assaulted on a dead world called Antheim in the system. It would be during this battle that the Primarch Vulkan would reunite with his Terran Legion, bringing with him not only vast amounts of warships that had been modified with his specifications, but 3,000 Astartes of the 18th Legion recruited from the population of Nocturne. Seeing these reinforcements bolstered the morale of the Terran 18th, and both forces quickly annihilated the orcs, driving back any of the orc survivors. The Nocturnian legionnaires and the Terran legionnaires of the 18th would meet, and as Vulkan and the Astartes from Nocturne removed their helms to reveal their pitch black skin and red burning eyes, the Terran Legion instinctually knew that this was their Primarch and these were their brothers. They would kneel before Vulkan and the Nocturnians, but the Primarch would bid them to rise, saying that all of his sons were equal and he was no petty king needing shows of obedience. Vulkan himself would actually kneel before his own legion to honor their sacrifices. It's said in multiple sources that before ever being reunited with Vulkan, the 18th Legion was known for some time as the Dragon Warriors, but the name's origin isn't explained. There is a reason why the Terran Legion wasn't startled by the Primarch's appearance, nor the appearance of their Nocturnian brothers, but to explain it accurately, I have to build up to it, so it will be later in the video. However, I will say now that it has to do with the Legion's original heraldry. The master of the Terran 18th Legion was Cassian Vaughn, and he had been fatally wounded in the conflict against the orcs. Vulkan would assume leadership of his legion, but would honor Vaughn by gifting him the power claw of the orc that struck him down. Vulkan would also construct a unique dreadnought for the hero called the Iron Dragon. Henceforth, Cassian Vaughn would be known as Cassian Dracos, and he would become a venerable dreadnought and the guardian of Nocturne. After this, Vulkan would make changes to his legion, bringing the 18th Legion to his homeworld of Nocturne. At the discovery of Nocturne and the 18th Primarch Project, Nocturne's technological sophistication increased. Being a death world, there were limitations to the changes that could be made, but the city settlements of Nocturne would receive resources from the Imperium, becoming sanctuary cities, protected by high adamantium walls and void shields that protected them from volcanic debris launched into the air and falling back to the earth. The environment of Nocturne was part of what shaped its people into tough individuals, and so not much else was changed so as to continue producing that caliber of people. However, the planet's moon, Prometheus, was made into the Legion's fortress monastery. In regards to the changes made to the 18th Legion, their color scheme had already been green, but elements of Nocturne were added. Gold and copper trim would be incorporated, as well as Saurian skin pelts and symbols of Nocturne. Portions of armor design became scaled and Saurian-like after the fauna found on Nocturne. The Legion's name would be changed to the Salamanders, named after the fire-breathing lizards that inhabit Mount Deathfire. Like every legion, the Salamander's Legion would follow the basic organization outlined by the Principia Bellicosa, but would have units that were unique to the legion, such as the Pyroclasts, which were the legion destroyers who used powerful heavy flamers in battle, and the Fire Drakes, who were the Terminator armored honor guard of Vulkan himself. Vulkan would actually make the veterans of the Terran 18th amongst his first Fire Drakes, as they exemplified the virtues he aspired his legion to have. When we look at the Legion symbols of the 18th Legion after they are reunited with their Primarch, they include dragons. Their white dragon head heraldry was inspired by the Fire Drake skull that Vulkan had on his own shoulder guard. The beast whose skull it was named Kisari, and he would also wear its skin as a cape. They included what could only be assumed to be Nocturnian script, which looks almost exactly like cuneiform, which is interesting because while the names of places on Nocturne hint at Greek culture, cuneiform adds a reference to Mesopotamia. Of course, the cuneiform is not identical to real-world cuneiform in the formation of words, but it's interesting that the script was included in the way that it was. The diamond-like shape of the markings is a reference to hazard warning signs. Fire, flame symbols, smoldering embers were all painted onto the armor as well. All of these symbols were descriptions of the death world of Nocturne, but more importantly, they were expressions of the Promethean cult. Each legion had their own way of incorporating the Imperial Truth into their ranks. The Salamander's Legion's version of the Imperial Truth was the Promethean cult. Named after Prometheus, both the Greek titan who stole fire from the gods and gave it to mankind only to be eternally tortured for it, and Nocturne's moon, Prometheus, which was responsible for the environment of the planet, the Promethean cult was created by Vulkan when he was learning besides the Emperor during the early Great Crusade. It was a mix of lessons, values, and teachings from Nocturnian culture and the secular imperial truth of the Emperor, using metaphors and symbols like the hammer, the anvil, fire, the forge, volcanoes, and embers, sourced from the blacksmith traditions of Nocturne. The Promethean cult conveyed that the Astartes of the 18th Legion were themselves brutal weapons that were forged, tested, and refined in the fires of battle and upon the anvil of war. Their purpose was the protection and liberation of humanity. It taught the values of self-reliance, loyalty, duty, self-discipline, endurance, and sacrifice. Even before being reunited with Vulkan, the Legion had been known as the Dragon Warriors. They had experienced trials by fire and stood in defense of humanity amongst humanity. I do think that the Emperor, who first used these metaphors toward the Legion, influenced Vulkan's philosophy toward the imperial truth. Perhaps this is why the Emperor participated in the trials of Nocturne with Vulkan. I think the Promethean cult held the secrets to the Legion's purpose in regards to their creation, which was to give itself for the sake of humanity. But the Promethean cult also tempered the urge towards self-sacrifice that the Legion had by encouraging self-discipline, mindfulness, and mastery. When not socializing with the human tribes of Nocturne, Astartes of the Salamander's Legion often spent time alone, thinking about their purpose, forging and mastering their weapons, or engaging in secular rituals to sharpen their focus. Some of these rituals included branding oneself before and after battle, as well as extensive scarification on the body and the face. Many veterans of the 18th Legion had heavily scarred bodies and faces, most of which were self-inflicted. This element, I believe, alludes to the generalized tribal culture of Nocturne. In the real world, scarification was practiced more by darker-skinned peoples overall, as the markings were more visible on the skin in comparison to inking the skin with tattoos. Considering the peoples of Nocturne had pitch-black skin, it makes sense. The Promethean cult gave meaning to the Salamander's own nature and brought the Legion out of a near infatuation with self-destruction for the sake of sacrifice. And when the Legion resumed the Great Crusade, they were truly a Legion reforged. As the Legion rejoined the Great Crusade, it was part of an expeditionary fleet, the 154th Expeditionary Fleet, deployed besides an Imperial Army regiment that had been recruited from a death world. The Salamander's Legion would bring hundreds of worlds into Imperial compliance, fighting alongside other legions like the Iron Hands, the Death Guard, and the Night Lords. Vulkan and his forces would discover a webway portal on a feral world whose humans sympathized with the Eldari, and so Vulkan had the world destroyed via Exterminatus. Vulkan would also have conflicts with Conrad Curze when their legions were deployed. The Night Haunter had an entire city slaughtered to sow fear in the rest of the population. Vulkan, who believed very deeply in humanity's defense, had a serious problem with this, and so he and Curze would physically fight. After this campaign, Vulkan would report Curze's atrocities to both the War Master, Horus Lupercal, who was still loyal at the time, and Rogol Doran. The specialization of war for the Salamanders, I would say, is mechanical engineering. The Salamanders' Legion became known for their master-crafted weapons, being that blacksmithing was a tradition on Nocturne, and they often modified their own weapons both visually and functionally. This, combined with their primary focus on flame and melta-based weapons, made them a dangerous legion to fight against. Vulkan himself designed and crafted many weapons of war. For example, in the creation of the Iron Drake's Dreadnought chassis for Cassian Dracos, Vulkan created the first ever ironclad dreadnoughts. He also created the prototype for the Astartes strike cruiser. His warhammer, Dawnbringer, was actually a weapon that he made for Horus Lupercal upon Horus becoming War Master, and he made a sword for Ferrus Manus that Manus carried around and used occasionally. As said before, their time during the Great Crusade was spent mostly bringing people back into the Imperium and fighting against either Orcs or Eldari. However, they were one of the legions that suffered greatly during the Isstvan V atrocity, also known as the Dropsite Massacre. Joining the Iron Hands and the Raven Guard as one of the Shattered Legions, the Salamanders were caught in the maelstrom of battle. After the decimation of Isstvan III, Horus's betrayal was revealed, and the Emperor ordered 7 legions to face the 4 traitor legions and destroy them on Isstvan V. He didn't know that 4 of the 7 apparently loyal legions were also traitors. It was horrible. The Salamanders, Raven Guard, and Iron Hands faced off against the Sons of Horus first, then the Death Guard, who had deployed a gas weapon that killed many, then the World Eaters attacked with Angron leading them. A fight between Angron and Vulkan was stopped by an orbital explosion before the two forces could even get close to each other in close combat. It appeared that the World Eaters had initiated a retreat, and at the same time, the Iron Warriors, Alpha Legion, Word Bearers, and Night Lords began to deploy at the Loyalist lines. Seeing this, the Salamanders and the Raven Guard began to retreat as well, to allow respite to their own forces and allow the reinforcements to earn glory. But it was as they were heading back to their own lines that the Iron Warriors opened fire on the remaining Salamanders and Raven Guard, cutting down the survivors. With shots coming from the north and the south, the majority of the remaining Loyalist legions were caught in between and savagely cut down within the first few seconds of this attack. Ferrus Manus, who had refused to retreat, was killed and decapitated by Fulgrim. The Iron Warriors dropped a tactical atomic bomb that killed thousands of Astartes. The forces that survived the explosion struggled to board flyers and escape the world, choosing to survive another day if possible, rather than face annihilation. When the remaining Salamanders made it off the planet, it was too late when they realized that their Primarch wasn't amongst them. Vulkan survived the atomic bomb, but was surrounded by the enemy and chose to fight to his death. Eventually, he was shot, stabbed, and beat up into unconsciousness. It would be Conrad Curze who would take Vulkan's body, chaining it up before torturing Vulkan in ways that only the Twisted Night Haunter could. It was here that it was revealed to both Curze and Vulkan that Vulkan was a perpetual. No matter what damage was done to Vulkan's body, it would return to health. Conrad Curze would then use death as a means of torture for Vulkan, killing him in a variety of ways to try and break him. Curze would chop off Vulkan's head, He would cut his throat out with dinner utensils. He would sever limbs from Vulkan. He would have Vulkan shot to death from the gunfire of 100 bolters. Vulkan experienced each attempt at his life over and over and over again, only to be restored to health again. His agony reminds me of the agony of Prometheus, who was tied to the face of a cliff and had his liver eaten by a raptor, only for it to regrow again and have it eaten again. Kurz even tried to break Vulkan mentally by having a Davenite priest induce visions of Vulkan trying to save innocent civilians and failing. Still, Vulkan wouldn't break, though his sanity was starting to slip. Growing bored of Vulkan, Kurz would offer Vulkan the chance for freedom. He had Perturabo construct an impossible maze and placed Vulkan's warhammer, Dawnbringer, at its center. It was designed with so many ways to confuse and kill an individual within it that they were never intended to make it to its center. But miraculously, Vulkan actually made it to the center, fighting Kurz briefly. Vulkan would activate the secret teleportation device in his warhammer and be transported across the galaxy in the upper atmosphere of Macragge. As he descended, he was burnt to a crisp, but he knew where he was, and he knew that he was perpetual, and he knew that he would be safe amongst the Ultramarines before his consciousness faded to black. Vulkan's body was recovered on Macragge, but shortly after would be stabbed by a perpetual called John Grammaticus, who was serving the Cabal, which is this mysterious alien organization. But he stabbed Vulkan with a piece of fulgurite, the only material in the galaxy that could destroy a perpetual. Vulkan would legitimately die after this, and his body would be given to the first captain of the Salamanders, whose name was Numion. Numion was a Terran veteran of the Legion and a member of the Pyre Guard who had coordinated the retreat of the Salamanders on Ispan 5. Believing that he would be able to bring Vulkan back to life once on Nocturne, Numion would have the Primarch's body lowered into the lava of Mount Deathfire. With no result for days, Numion would sacrifice himself into the lava in an attempt to bring his Primarch back. Sometime later, a figure was found wandering the hostile terrain of Nocturne. Awed and in disbelief, it was discovered to be the Primarch Vulkan reborn. Vulkan truly couldn't die. Vulkan lived. Because of the damage the Legion faced during Ispan 5, it could not truly play an active role in the Horus Heresy, though Vulkan would be called to Terra by the Emperor himself to assist with matters occurring in the Webway. After the Horus Heresy, Rabute Guilliman would become the Lord Commander of the Imperium. He would divide the legions into chapters of 1,000 Marines each. However, both the Space Wolves and the Salamanders would be spared this edict and would still functionally be small legions of Adeptus Astartes. Interestingly enough, both the Space Wolves and the Salamanders were part of the Trefoil legions made with specific purpose by the Emperor, separate from the other legions, and so this may be why. However, they still organized themselves in a way that adhered to the Codex Astartes and would refer to themselves as a chapter. Vulkan himself would lead his chapter for some time following the heresy, but then he would mysteriously disappear. Vulkan would leave a book called the Tome of Fire for his chapter. In the book, Vulkan wrote that he would return to the chapter only when 9 artifacts that he had created were found by their Forge Father, or Chapter Master of the Salamanders. This book would lead to the search for the 9 artifacts across the galaxy. It is known, however, that Vulkan did return to the Imperium during the War of the Beast to defend Terra from the massive Orc attack, but he refused to see his chapter, likely because they had not found all the artifacts required for him to return to them. I think the aspect of humanity that Vulkan embodied was heroism. Heroism is defined in simple terms as great bravery, but is also defined as heroic conduct, especially in fulfilling a higher purpose or a noble end. Heroism actually encompassed many values and virtues such as valor, bravery, courage, daring, and fortitude. I think both the 18th Legion and Vulkan embodied this aspect. If we look at the history of the 18th Legion, the Dragon Warriors, the Salamanders were examples of heroism. During the war against the Ethnarch of the Caucasus Wastes, it was the 18th Legion who traversed the Tempest Galleries, destroying the shield generators and allowing the Emperor his victory. During a crucial moment of decision to embark upon a suicide mission to destroy the generator, the Legion had to resort to a system of voting who would commit to the mission, not because they lacked volunteers, but because everyone volunteered for the mission. During the early Great Crusade, when the 18th Legion were sent out in small groups across many expeditionary fleets, they were often the only Astartes present, and they led the human forces in battle, being particularly effective when the battle was at its worst. When all hope was gone, the human forces looked toward the 18th Legion as they would look toward heroes. When both sides of the Legion met, the 18th Legion had been fighting to rescue the humans battling against the orcs before they themselves were rescued by the Nocturnian recruits to their Legion. In the latter Great Crusade, the Salamanders would serve as paragons of heroism to countless worlds, freeing them from the predation of Xenos. The 18th Legion were consistently heroes before and after the Great Crusade. When looking at Vulkan's story, Vulkan became the hero of Nocturne when he stood up against the Dark Eldar who had enslaved the people of the world before his arrival, inspiring all of the Nocturnians to fight back against their oppressors. At the last task of the competition between the Emperor and Vulkan on Mount Deathfire, though Vulkan would technically win the contest by returning to the settlements with a large fire drake, it was the fact that the Emperor saved Vulkan, the Emperor's heroism, that would inspire Vulkan's loyalty. While the 18th Legion embodied the spirit of heroism, they were warriors like all the legions were intended to be. However, to Vulkan and the 18th, their purpose as warriors was to be examples and defenders of humanity, to not waver in that responsibility, and this focus was complemented by their innate sense of heroism and all the qualities included in it. Heroism is not an identity, but a collection of values. Those who are said to have demonstrated heroism are marked out not for being different from other people or having certain talents that give them an edge over others, but because they were just like those around them, but made the decision to be great, the decision toward heroic action for the benefit of others. The Salamanders didn't hold themselves as better than humanity, and despite the fact that they are transhuman warriors, they regarded humanity at a level that was unlike any other legion, and they were deeply concerned with the safekeeping of innocence. This humanized them in a way that most other legions could not be, and this was despite their terrifying appearance. In temperament, Vulkan himself was a very wise and introspective Primarch. In battle, he was possessed of a fury that shocked his Primarch brothers. Similar to Dorn, Vulkan was an idealist, but he was different in that he was guided most by what he thought was right, where Dorn was guided most by what he thought his duty was. Similar to Logar and to Guilliman, Vulkan would be amongst the Primarchs that would write books to guide his legion, such as the Promethean Cult and the Tome of Fire. But in comparison, Logar taught religion as an expression of the imperial truth, whereas Vulkan taught Freemasonry as an example of the imperial truth. In relation to the other Primarch projects, Vulkan was uncharacteristically warm and brotherly toward them, being especially close to Ferrus Manus, them sharing interest in blacksmithing and craftsmanship. He would express happiness and joy more than the other Primarchs, even going so far as to hug Rogol Dorn before the Siege of Terra. Vulkan would even admit to Rogol Dorn that he didn't have it within him to kill one of his Primarch brothers even if they had betrayed the Emperor. This actually disgusted Dorn a little bit, but it wasn't clear whether Dorn was disgusted that Vulkan couldn't kill his traitorous brothers, or the fact that Rogol Dorn did and could kill his Primarch brothers. The theme of sacrifice is tied to the Salamanders, and sacrifice is tied to heroism. There is often a price for heroic behavior, and that price is sometimes life. But those who commit to it are willing to do so for some greater purpose or greater ideal, for the lives of others, for the future, or for humanity. Heroism as an aspect of humanity is one of the driving aspects behind the idea of humanity. Throughout this series, I talk about aspects of humanity as if I'm trying to define it. That's because I am trying to define it. Humanity itself is an ideal. It's a set of expectations, beliefs, and codes of conduct that raise us up from our more base and animalistic urges and sets the ground for our higher nature, our intelligence, and creativity to express themselves. Humanity ceases to be a reality if it is not upheld and pushed forward into the future. One of the most enduring aspects of humanity is its capacity for heroism in the face of tragedy. Witnessing and knowing about acts of heroism inspires most of us to raise up our own standards and be ready to commit to heroism as well. Most of us have deep emotional reactions to scenes of heroic behavior in books and in movies because it gives us a sense of noble possibility, of resilience, and of defiance. This reaction is strongest when heroic behavior is meant to protect innocence and the ideal of humanity itself. In the galaxy-wide endeavor of the Great Crusade, heroic action would be just as important as the other requirements for its success. Vulkan and the Salamanders embodied this, and because Vulkan did, he was told by the Emperor that he was his proudest achievement. The Geneseed organ that I associate with Vulkan is the Melanochrome. The Melanochrome is a Geneseed organ that controls the amount of melanin in an Astartes skin. It is reactive to the external environments of the Astartes. In areas of high sunlight or radiation, an Astartes skin will naturally darken to protect them from the harmful rays. In standard environments of strong sunlight, a standard Astartes complexion will shift to darker shades of brown temporarily. Astartes complexion could even go in the opposite direction as an adaptation, developing pale skin at the lack of sunlight. For standard Astartes, this is affected by the external environment and it is temporary. And of course, the polar opposite would be the environment of Nocturne, which imbued its inhabitants with pitch-black melanistic skin to endure their star's harsh rays. Vulkan's Geneseed was unique in that the Emperor added perpetual DNA into Vulkan's Primarch template. However, there also appeared to be other modifications made by the Emperor. The salamanders would be known for their pitch-black skin and their red burning eyes. Vulkan's Geneseed did not imbue those implanted with his Geneseed with pitch-black skin complexion or red burning eyes. It is proven throughout various artworks of salamanders throughout the years that while on Terra, the Legion was visually just as diverse as any other Legion in its beginning. In fact, Vulkan's natural complexion is unknown, being that he was raised on Nocturne. The Terran 18th Legion had Terran-influenced complexions at first, and those legionnaires made on Nocturne had the pitch-black skin and complexion and the red-burning eyes that was imbued by Nocturne. However, due to the environment of Nocturne, when the Legion's homeworld was made to be the death world of Nocturne, those Terran legionnaires who experienced the conditions were affected by the high levels of ultraviolet radiation, even on Prometheus. Due to the adaptive nature of the Melanochrome, even the Terran legionnaires developed darker skin complexion, but as I said earlier, all Astartes skin would darken in highly radioactive environments. What made the 18th Legion Geneseed unique was that their Geneseed was permanently altered by this kind of environment, and it could not go back to its previous appearance. It is said that even Terran legionnaires of the 18th Legion who experienced environments of high heat or radiation would have their skin permanently darkened into a gravel-like color. Terran legionnaires of the 18th Legion's eyes would also develop an amber-like glow as well. These traits were part of Vulkan's Geneseed, and when the Terran Legion made Nocturne their home, their physiology responded in kind, giving them the same appearance as their Nocturnian brothers. Even Vulkan's complexion would have eventually turned pitch black and his eyes would glow in that kind of environment even if he hadn't have landed on Nocturne, and this explains why neither his or his legion's complexion ever shifted back to whatever it was before. It was a condition of their Geneseed that they remained darkened. There are many forms of art of Vulkan and the Salamanders with dark brown complexions, ranging from fan art to even some official art. While I 100% understand the reason to want to portray both with dark brown skin, it simply isn't lore accurate. Since Rogue Trader, the Salamanders in art have been shown as having diverse complexion. This was during the days before Warhammer 40k was Warhammer 40k. As far back as 2nd edition, Salamander miniatures have been painted with pitch black skin, red eyes, and light colored hair. In some other publications of miniature showcases, the Salamanders have been portrayed as having diverse complexions, but in art it remained pretty consistent that they had pitch black skin and red eyes. In conclusion, you can paint your miniatures however you like and portray the 18th in art however you like, but according to available lore, painting Vulkan and Nocturnian salamanders with brown complexion is not accurate to the actual lore and the effect of their Geneseed. But complexion is not the only reason why I assign the Melanochrome to Vulkan and the salamanders. Similar to how exposure to high amounts of radiation can make humans infertile, a progenoid Geneseed organ that is exposed to high amounts of radiation can destroy the germ cells within the progenoid. At a minimum, this can lead to malfunctioning or dysfunctional Geneseed organs, and at most, this can completely invalidate the progenoid glands. Despite the high amounts of radiation shown on Nocturne, the salamander progenoid remains stable, mostly standard, and does not have any negative flaws that prevents it from producing functional Geneseed organs or from being imbued into new recruits. Unlike other Primarchs whose complexion was due to adaptation or degradation of their Geneseed or environment, it appears that Vulkan's Primarch template and Geneseed were specifically designed to have this reaction. It is here that I think we uncover the purpose of the 18th Legion, to be able to fight and endure highly radioactive and extremely hot temperature environments. This explains the kinds of battlefields that the early 18th were deployed onto. It explains why the Emperor chose the 18th to assault the subterranean Tempest galleries. It explains the statement the Emperor made about the Legion emerging from the fire at the battle's conclusion. It explains why the early Legion symbol was the skull with burning eyes and why they were given the name Dragon Warriors. It was because the Legion absolutely terrified the first humans they encountered due to their red glowing eyes in the dark, inspiring the humans to call them the Devils in the Dark, which inspired the skull and burning eye heraldry. This is why, when the Terran Legion met with Vulkan and the Nocturnian legionnaires of the 18th, they were not startled or shocked by their appearance. It was because many of the Terran Legion looked just like Vulkan and the Nocturnian salamanders. At first, I thought Vulkan's perpetual genetics didn't pass down to his Legion, but now I'm thinking that maybe it's in the salamander's Geneseed resilience toward being destroyed by high radiation and heat that Vulkan's perpetual genetics are passed down. While it doesn't extend the lives or make the Astartes of the 18th Legion perpetual, their Geneseed endures where others would be destroyed. This adds a new layer to the saying, Vulkan lives. It also seems that the only reason the salamanders didn't have official successors was because their complexion and eyes were interpreted as flaws instead of gifts from the Emperor during the 40th millennium. This belief would actually lead to a Salamander's successor chapter being made during the Cursed Founding, during which the Salamander's Geneseed was modified in an attempt to get rid of that supposed flaw. This led to a creation of a chapter called the Black Dragons that was cursed with even more flaws due to that Geneseed. With the Ultima founding and the creation of Primaris Marines, the Salamanders have been reinforced with Primaris Marines of Vulkan's lineage, and the chapter has begun incorporating Primaris organs into their Astartes creations. Even with the much more stable gene seed used to create Primaris salamanders, the Melanochrome still responds to the environment of Nocturne in the same way that the old Legion always has. Chapters made from Vulkan's gene seed, thus Salamander's successors, were made successfully during the Ultima founding, giving the chapter successors where they did not have them before. With the nature of Primaris Marines having gene seed that is more stable than what existed previously, but still reacting to high radiation and heat environments, hypothetically speaking, Salamander successor chapters like the Dragon Spears, the Black Vipers, would have gene seeds that react in the same way in those conditions. However, if the gene seed was modified in any way, then they wouldn't have such an extreme or permanent reaction to heat or high radiation, allowing them a normal range of complexion instead of the Salamander Obsidian Black, and only giving them temporary glowing eyes. We don't really know which is the case because we haven't had any official art of the Salamander successor chapters or descriptions of their complexions. And that was my deep dive into the 18th Primarch Project, Vulkan, and the 18th Legion of the Adeptus Astartes, the Salamanders. I hope you all enjoyed and that you learned something new. And if you did, please like and subscribe for more content if you haven't already, and please share this with a hobby friend if you think they would also enjoy it, as it really helps the channel grow. With nothing else to say, Inquisitor Vaughn out. Remember, the Emperor protects and the future is successor.